A very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to the ICANN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. Um, I went through the newspapers in Hindu and Indian Express yesterday, but there was hardly any news. So that is why I decided to club yesterday's and today's newspaper and then give the analysis today itself, combining both the days. So today we will start with the topics, but again, even in today's newspaper, I didn't find very important or such very good articles. I didn't find, though we had some very important topics in bits and pieces. So let's start with the first topic. The first topic is about India-Pakistan relations, which is international or bilateral relations as a part of your GS2 syllabus. So in this, recently, you know that the 75th anniversary of the United Nations has happened. So on the occasion of which there is a special session that is going on at the United Nations. So the United Nations General Assembly session was going on, in which the Prime Minister of India as well as of Pakistan gave speeches. So while the Indian Prime Minister mostly emphasized on the UNSC reforms that are required and how India has played such a prominent role at the various fora of United Nations, India being the largest democracy, and it has such a huge population, and it has been the largest contributor to the United Nations peacekeeping forces. And India has also consistently performed good economically, and India has followed the track record of nuclear non-proliferation. So because of all of these reasons, Indian Prime Minister's speech was mostly focused on emphasizing the need for reforms at the United Nations. But however, the Pakistan Prime Minister went on a very different note, and he, in most of his speech, was concentrated on attacking India. So this will definitely lead to a further deterioration of the India-Pakistan relations. So at this Pakistan Prime Minister's speech at the United Nations General Assembly, he drew parallel between the Indian administration and Nazi Germany. He drew parallel between the Citizenship Amendment Act that the Parliament that was introduced in India, that was equated with the Nuremberg laws in Germany that sought to name the Jews and also to start persecuting the Jews. And similarly, the detention camps in Assam in India were equated with the concentration camps that happened in Nazi Germany. So like that, it drew parallel between the Indian administration and the fact the Prime Minister of Pakistan also highlighted that India is in the government of India is doing the state sponsorship of Islamophobia, where it is trying to inculcate fear against Islam, and it is also following the policy of racial purity and supremacy, and that is why it is enacting laws like the Citizenship Amendment Act to persecute all the minorities. And this is similar to the German concept of racial purity. So like that, this whole thing is a genocide by the state. So these were some of the things that the Prime Minister of Pakistan told at the UNGA session. So such things definitely will lead to further deterioration in the relations between India and Pakistan. So whenever you are analyzing the India-Pakistan relations, you can make a mention of the bitterness that is existing between the two countries and what the Pakistan Prime Minister had to say at the UNGA session regarding its relations with India and equating Indian administration with the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. So now we move on to the next topic. The next topic is it relates to the application of artificial intelligence, and it can also be used in use of technology in agriculture and also under the topic of startups. So artificial intelligence by itself is a very important buzzword which has been in news for more than 2 years now. So that topic itself becomes very important for you in the exam. And even in the previous ICANN videos, we have already discussed artificial intelligence and its application in various areas. So this is going to be an example of a field in which artificial intelligence can be applied. So therefore, whenever you're writing any answer on artificial intelligence and its application, you can use this as an example. And secondly, you also have a topic on agriculture and the use of e-technology in farming in agriculture. So you can also write this example when you're talking about agricultural reforms, in which one of the important aspects is going to be better integration of technology in agriculture, in which case the use of artificial intelligence in agriculture can be very remunerative to the farmers. And thirdly, this tool that we are going to talk about, this tool of artificial intelligence that is developed by a startup named as Agnext Technologies. So whenever you are writing any answer to a question that is based on the startups and why they need to be promoted and encouraged in India, one of the arguments that you can give is they have these kind of startups, they come out with very innovative solutions to so many different problems and in so many different sectors in the economy. So of which you can give this as an example to illustrate how diverse these startups can be and in which all sectors they can have a very meaningful contribution. So the same content you can apply in at least 3 different topics, and all of 3 topics come under your GS3 syllabus. So here what this Agnext Technologies has done is it has developed a machine learning tool by which the tool is able to recognize the quality of agricultural produce. The premise is that now farmers come to the mandis with a lot of produce, and irrespective of one produce being of higher quality, superior quality compared to another produce, there is no premium amount that is given to the farmer who comes with a very high quality produce. But contrast this with the supply of milk. So in the case of milk, the price given to the farmers is based upon the fat content in the milk. So but however, for the grains and for vegetables, there is no premium price that is paid to the farmers for bringing quality agricultural products. So in this case, what Agnext Technologies is going to do is to ascertain the quality of the produce. For example, it is going to analyze the chemical characteristics of the food, which can be gluten in the case of wheat, it can be amylose in the case of paddy, it can be caffeine in the case of coffee, and polyphenols in the case of tea. So like that, it is going to analyze the various chemical characteristics of food to ascertain what is the quality of the food. So this in the first place helps us to pay good prices to farmers who come with quality produce. It also helps the consumers to consume very qualitative products, and it's also an incentive to the farmers to produce very quality agricultural commodities so that they can be paid the premium price. So all this happens with the help of technology, which is great. So and this also illustrates the role of startups like Agnext Technologies. So I hope you will be able to use these examples in all the 3 areas, as in when you are answering questions depending upon the in whichever area it is. So now we move on to the next topic. The next topic we'll be discussing is India-Sri Lanka relations, which is bilateral relations and a part of your GS2 syllabus under the international relations topic. So the India-Sri Lanka relations is in news because the Indian Prime Minister and the Sri Lankan Prime Minister recently had a virtual meeting. So in which they emphasized, the Indian side, the Indian government emphasized upon the implementation of 13th Amendment by Sri Lanka. So now let us see what this all about, what this is. So if you look at the ethnic composition of Sri Lanka, then you know that the northern and the eastern provinces are dominated by Tamilians, while the central southern provinces are dominated by the Sinhalese. So there are 2 main ethnic groups, if we can say, in Sri Lanka, which is the Tamilians on the one hand, who are residing in the northern and the eastern part, and the Sinhalese, who form the majority ethnic group in Sri Lanka. So these Tamilians, being the minority, they have been deprived of several rights and due to which they have always wanted separation from Sri Lanka. So they wanted a separate country of their own, and there was also the LTT wars that happened. So in all this process, these Tamilians in the northern and the eastern part of Sri Lanka were deprived of their rights, they were deprived of their lands, they were displaced from their lands, they lost their houses, they lost their livelihoods. The women suffered badly because of physical and sexual violence. So there was a lot that happened, and the region has suffered a lot. And India has always been supporting the fact that these Tamil dominated region must be given autonomy by Sri Lanka, because they are a definite chunk of people when we talk of ethnicity, and they must be given more autonomy in ruling themselves. So, in this regard, in 1987, an India Sri Lanka Accord was signed, which said that the 13th Amendment to the Sri Lankan Constitution is going to be made, and this amendment is to give more freedom or more autonomy to the northern and the eastern provinces in Sri Lanka. It is going to provide for more provincial councils where they will be having more autonomy. But however, these provincial councils, when even when they were formed, it was not the autonomy was not devolved much in the northern and the eastern councils, and also they were not even formed through election until a few years ago. While it was formed for the rest of the other population of Sri Lanka, in the northern and the eastern part, this formation of provincial councils through election was also neglected. So basically, these Tamilians in the northern and the eastern part have not been given that autonomy which was promised as part of the 13th Amendment in 1987 India Sri Lanka Accord. So now, in the virtual meeting that happened between the Indian Prime Minister and the Sri Lankan Prime Minister, the Indian Prime Minister has emphasized that Sri Lanka must implement the 13th Amendment, and it must address the aspirations of the Tamil minority of Sri Lanka. In fact, India's policy has always been to ensure equality, justice, peace, and respect within Sri Lanka, and this can be done by giving or addressing the aspirations of the Tamil minorities, for which India has been calling for Sri Lanka to implement the 13th Amendment. However, now there are talks going on within Sri Lanka that this 13th Amendment may be abolished and it will never be implemented. So, such talks are also now going on within Sri Lanka. So, this is going to have repercussions on the India Sri Lanka relations. And with respect to the Tamil issue, India has always been impacted by this, and the Tamil issue has always been important for us. We had also even participated in the war by sending our troops there. So, in India's interest, we have always been asking for the Sri Lankan government to provide more autonomy and take care, or for the Sri Lankan government to provide for welfare measures for the northern and the eastern part, which has not happened much. So this is about the 13th Amendment and how it can impact the India-Sri Lanka relations. Now we move on to the next topic. The next topic we'll be discussing is the issues related to federalism, which is a part of your GS2 syllabus. So, how the Farm Acts, the three bills that have been introduced by the Parliament, and how it impinges on the spirit of cooperative federalism, we have already in detail analyzed it in the last week's articles. So, in this article, the main reason why I have included this article is first because it gives a clarity on some basics which you will have to write in your answer, particularly if it is a 15-marker question. Because in a 15-marker question, you have to show some analysis, and you also have to start from some basic understanding of what this federal structure is all about, and only then you go on to the analysis. So, right from the first word, you don't jump into the analysis in the case of a 15-marker question. So, in such a case, you have to know some basic things about the 7th schedule and how it is kind of dividing the power to enact legislations under the three lists. So we have a 7th schedule in the Constitution, and also one more reason why I have included this article is because I want to introduce you all to two important doctrines that is used by the judiciary whenever it has to hold any law as constitutional or void. So it uses these doctrines to uphold the law or to declare it as null and void. So these doctrines are commonly used, and you must know about it. So this is another reason why this article has been incorporated in the discussion. So firstly, we'll start with the 7th schedule of the Constitution, which talks about the three lists. The Union list is a list of subjects on which the Union can enact laws. State list being the list of subjects on which the state government can enact laws, and the concurrent list on which both the Union and the state government have concurrent powers to enact laws. But in the case of a concurrent list, if even the state has enacted a legislation and if the union has enacted an act on a subject on the concurrent list, then which of the two is going to be valid, then that will be determined by Article 254. Article 254 says that whenever there is a conflict between the law made by the union and the law made by the state on any subject in the concurrent list, then the law that is made by the Parliament is going to prevail according to Article 254. So first of all, the 7th schedule shows that there is a division of lawmaking power, but in the case of concurrent list, the more power lies with the union, because if both have made the laws, then the law that is made by the parliament is going to prevail according to Article 254. So as I have also said previously, that writing articles in questions on polity is very important. So you have to memorize such important articles. So while you're making notes itself, just highlight the articles, and so that you can keep on going through it again and again. So when we talk of cooperative federalism, or at least federalism per se, in the S.R. Bommai versus Union of India case that happened in 1994, federalism was declared to be the basic structure of the constitution. So the basic structure doctrine also we have seen a couple of days before when we were discussing about the Keshwananda Bharati case. Reason being, the seer had recently passed away, and because of which the Keshwananda Bharati case was in news, and from that case derived the basic structure doctrine. And after this doctrine, several cases came, and these several cases judiciary declared many features to be a part of the basic structure of the constitution. So in the S.R. Bommai case, Supreme Court had declared federalism to be a basic structure of the constitution. So this should not be violated. So whenever you are telling that basic structure of the constitution, federalism and all that, do make use of this judgment of S.R. Bommai. As I keep repeatedly telling you, that writing judgments and that will add more value to your answer. So you have to, it's not enough if you just tell that federalism is a basic structure of the doctrine, but imagine you writing that this was told by the Supreme Court in S.R. Bommai case, so that adds more value to your answer. So in this, as I said, one more thing that I wanted to introduce through this article is the two important doctrines which are used to determine whether a particular legislation is void or is constitutional. So that is the doctrine of pith and substance and the doctrine of colorable legislation. So now we'll understand what these two are. As we just discussed that now supposing there is a state list subject on which the state has enacted a law, and there is what the union does is the union enacts a legislation on a subject that is listed in the state list. So now this will be taken to the Supreme Court, and there will be arguments that union has enacted a law on a subject that is actually there in the state list. So therefore the union does not have the power to enact a law on this particular topic because it is there in the state list. So on this grounds, this particular law should be declared null and void. This is the argument. Then how does the court resolve this argument? The court sees that what is the substance, what is the core of this entire law that the union has enacted. Now suppose this is the law that the union has enacted, and this is the subject in the state list. So if the union law just makes an incidental encroachment upon the subject in the state list, then the Supreme Court will declare this law as valid. It is constitutional. That is, the union law is touching upon the state list subject only incidentally. But however, if the union law, this is the state subject, and the union law encroaches this much of the state subject, which is more than just incidentally, so in that case this law will be declared as unconstitutional. So if the law made by the union touches upon that stateless subject only incidentally, then that is going to be declared as a law that is valid and constitutional. But if the law made by the union touches upon the core of the state subject itself, then that is going to be declared as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So this is the doctrine of pith and substance. Alright, which is going to see the pith, which is the core part, and the substance of the law that the union has made. So if the most important portion of the law made by the union incidentally touches upon the stateless subject, it is going to be declared as constitutional. But if it touches more than, if it impinges on the entire subject in the state list, then that is going to be declared as unconstitutional. So now to give you an example, in the Farm Bills case, agriculture is a state subject. So what the center has enacted through the three legislations on farm bills is talking about mostly agriculture related fairs and markets, everything comes under the state list. And by enacting legislations that is covering the APMC mandis etc., the center is impinging in a way on the state list, and this is where the doctrine of pith and substance could be invoked to determine if this law is constitutionally valid or not. The second doctrine is the doctrine of colorable legislation. So if there is a law and which is actually constitutionally invalid, that is, it is unconstitutional, then if something is declared as unconstitutional by the court, then the government cannot do that indirectly. That means what the colorable legislation says, that if there is something that cannot be done directly, then the government should not and cannot do it indirectly also. For example, if the constitution already says that you cannot discriminate between people on the basis of their age, gender, place of birth, etc. But if there is some legislation which is trying to indirectly do this but not directly, then that legislation is also going to be invalid. So if you are forbidden from doing something directly, if doing something directly is unconstitutional, then doing the same thing indirectly is also unconstitutional. This is what the colorable legislation says. So you just cannot color and brush and paint the legislation with some new color and then claim that this is a brand new thing. So this is not that which was declared unconstitutional. Okay. So this is the doctrine of colorable legislation. And to get more clarity on what these concepts mean, what I want you to do is, in the comment section, each one of you will have to write, give an example for the doctrine of pith and substance and the doctrine of colorable legislation. You have to give an example in the comment section. So that's your small homework for today. So this is it for this topic. Now we'll move on to the next topic. The next topic we're going to be talking about is an important data related to crimes in India. So this can be a part of your GS1 where you talk about society and the crimes that are happening in the society. You may have a question on that. Or as a part of your GS2 syllabus where you talk about law and order, police, civil service, or anything. So this is about the crimes in India. Crimes in India report 2019 was recently published by NCRB, which is National Crime Records Bureau. So according to this, two important data that you need to know. First is that the crimes against women has gone up by 7.3% in 2019 compared to 2018. So crimes against women has increased by 7.3% and crimes against the scheduled castes has also increased by 7.3%. So therefore there is an increase in the crimes against women that is happening. And also one more important finding which is noteworthy is that of more than 4 lakh cases that were filed on crimes against women, of more than 4 lakh cases that have been filed with the police, out of this 31% of the cases, they fall in the category of cruelty by husband and his relatives. So this shows, this confirms the fact that there is a shadow pandemic that's happening. There is more violence that is happening within the 4 walls, within the home of the woman, where the laws are less applicable. That is, it's very difficult to go into the houses of everybody and to see if the women are facing any violence and discrimination. So 31% of the crimes are coming under the category of cruelty by husbands and his relatives. So this shows how important it is to protect women in their house itself, and this also explains why the reporting is also very less, because if somebody from the family itself is harassing women, then it becomes all the more difficult for women to come out to the police and to report the crime that is happening against her. So these data you have to make a note, take a note of it separately, and all the data you need to really revise well. And whenever you're writing any answer on women and the issues faced by women, so you will have to make a mention of the crimes that the women are facing in the society, and there has been an increase of 7.3% in the crimes faced by women as per the NCRB report Crimes in India 2019. So wherever possible, don't just quote the body NCRB, but also quote the name of the report, which is Crimes in India 2019. So wherever this is there, you quote, but it doesn't mean for every single data that you are quoting in the answer, you have to write the source of the data. That is not the case. Wherever you are talking about some prominent important data, you have to definitely quote it. But otherwise, I have seen few people asking in the comment section couple of months before that what is the source of this data, what is the source of, for every small data you don't have to write the source. Okay, so some data you can just write it like that. If you are writing some prominent data, like for example the crimes in India, that is NCRB data, then you can quote it as crimes in India. So similarly, you have something related to gender equality, then you can quote United Nations or ILO or something like that. So whatever IMF, World Economic Forum. So all of these are some of the important sources of data. So you can quote that whenever you are writing some data about them. But otherwise, for every single data that you write in your whole answer paper, you have to quote the source of it. That is no, there is no rule like that. So now we move on to the next topic. The next topic we are going to discuss is India-China-Pakistan relations. So usually what happens is a relation with one country may be affected or impacted because of the relations with some other country. So in mains, sometimes they just don't ask a very simple question based on bilateral relations between two countries, but rather they ask a more twisted question wherein they are asking a third country's relations with India and the kind of impact it is having on India's relations with some other countries. So this is a kind of complex or a twisted question that may be asked in mains rather than a simple, direct and straightforward bilateral relation based question. So in which case you will have to have some clarity on several things that are going on between the three countries so as to put up a good analysis in the form of your answer. So first of all, you know that India has had a lot of issues with Pakistan, most one being the state-sponsored policy of terrorism in Pakistan. So Pakistan has been allowing the usage of its soil and its land to launch terrorist attacks on India. So this has been the stated policy of Pakistan to sponsor terrorism. So because of this reason, Pakistan has also been on the grey list of the Financial Action Task Force. But however, the instances of terrorism hasn't reduced. Rather, Pakistan has gotten emboldened further to carry out these attacks, particularly because it is receiving that support from China. Pakistan is confident about the fact that it is going to receive a lot of support from China, and that is why Pakistan is not even fearful that there may be sanctions against Pakistan, or it is not even fearful about any retaliatory attacks from India, because it knows that China is always there to support Pakistan. So in this case, let's see what kind of support China has been giving. One is in the form of weapon supply. So since the 1970s, China has been providing conventional military weapons to Pakistan. So Pakistan has now built up a good set of military supplies which it can use on India in case India does any retaliatory attacks. So it has a good repository of the weapon systems from support from China. Second is the nuclear support. China has also supported Pakistan in the design of the reactor, in the design of the weapons, in the missile development technology. Also, China has supported Pakistan. So now Pakistan is also a nuclear power and is also developing tactical nuclear weapons, and therefore any attack on India which is will then be an attack between two nuclear states. So China has been giving this nuclear support to Pakistan as well. Third is the intelligence sharing. So there have been reports which shows the ISI officers of Pakistan being trained and the intelligence being shared from China for them. So such intelligence sharing is also done by China. Then China has the next fourth important thing is the economic cooperation that China has with Pakistan. China has invested heavily in Pakistan through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So because of this, Pakistan has become very important for China because of the huge investments that it has done in the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So due to this, it wants to protect its investments in Pakistan no matter what, and to protect its investment in Pakistan, China will go to any extent to support Pakistan. So that is why China has been such a tall support to Pakistan. Next is the diplomatic support that China has been giving. Apart from the support that China gives in the form of military and the economic support through financial money that China has been giving to Pakistan, China has also been supportive of Pakistan through the diplomatic efforts also. For example, Pakistan did not like India's revoking of Article 370. So since then, even China has been against this move, and it has repeatedly trying to raise the Kashmir issue in several international fora also. So through diplomatic support also, China is trying to support Pakistan, and somehow it is it is planning to strengthen Pakistan in a way that Pakistan becomes a very strong adversary against India. So it is because of these reasons that Pakistan is also becoming a hard country for India to tackle, because of the immense support that it is receiving from China. So if you have a question like, so Pakistan has been doing the state-sponsored terrorism for such a long time. It has also been on the grey list on FATF. But why is it that nothing is actually happening in the end? So that is because of the immense support that China has been giving. So you can have a question, what is the impact of China's support to Pakistan on India-Pakistan relations, or the India's efforts at making Pakistan accountable for its state-sponsored terrorism? So in such cases, all these points you will have to mention in your answer. Now we move on to the next topic. The next topic we'll be discussing is about the Monetary Policy Committee. So this Monetary Policy Committee has been tasked with the task of containing the level of inflation in the country. So this Monetary Policy Committee for the first time was given a statutory backing, and it came into existence in 2016. So because it has now been 4 years since 2016, the first term of the Monetary Policy Committee has now come to an end. So you may have a question on analysis of the working of Monetary Policy Committee. Has it really been successful in targeting inflation? So that is why this topic becomes very important, and definitely this is a part of your GS3 syllabus. And why this has been in news recently is because, as I said, this Monetary Policy Committee came in 2016, and this was given a statutory backing by amending the RBI Act. So in this Monetary Policy Committee has 6 members, where 3 members will be from RBI and 3 other members will be the external members. So these external members have a term of 4 years. So now this 4 years has come to an end, and these 3 external members are going to retire. So even when it was known to the government that these external members are going to retire because their term of 4 years has come to a completion, these external members have now not been appointed. So this issue has now come about that the external members' term has now expired, and new external members have still not been appointed by the government. So this is one issue. And also the Monetary Policy Committee holds bi-monthly meetings. So where it discusses the national and the international scenario, and it decides on the policy rates, that is the repo rate and the reverse repo rate. So the meetings are held by the Monetary Policy Committee bi-monthly. So another bi-monthly meeting was to happen now, but the RBI has now postponed this bi-monthly meeting, mainly because the 3 external members are now not present. They have not yet been appointed. So this is the issue because of which the Monetary Policy Committee is now in news. So as I said, it came into existence in 2016 by amending the RBI Act. So earlier, whatever decisions was to be taken based on what should be the repo rate in the country, what should be the reverse repo rate. So all these decisions was taken by the governor. Even though he had a team of members to assist him, it was eventually the governor who used to decide what should be the rate. So ultimate decision was in the hands of the governor. But now this ultimate decision has been given in the hands of the whole committee, that is the Monetary Policy Committee. Now committee as a whole is going to decide. Mostly it is going to decide through consensus, but if that is difficult to build, then it will decide by voting. So now it is not just on the governor to decide on the policy rates, it is now on the committee to decide the policy rates. Also earlier, the Reserve Bank of India was going behind multiple indicators to decide upon the repo rates and the reverse repo rates, whether it is the level of inflation in the economy or whether it is the level of foreign inflows, foreign currency inflows in the economy. So like that, it was tracking multiple indicators to determine what should be the repo rate and the reverse repo rate. But now RBI has been, through this MPC, given a single-handed job or a single target, which is the inflation targeting in the country. So RBI has been now given a target of 4 plus or minus 2%. That is, the inflation should be 4%, but there is a tolerance limit of plus or minus 2% to accommodate any exigencies. So this inflation targeting has now become the sole objective of RBI, which has been given this 4 plus or minus 2% of the inflation targeting that the RBI will have to achieve. And also this MPC, there is also provisions to ensure the accountability. So if the RBI, if the MPC fails to ensure that inflation is within this 4 plus or minus 2 range for a span of 3 consecutive meetings, then it will have to come out with reasons as to why there was a failure in keeping the inflation within this range and why it so happened that the inflation even went beyond this range. So it is answerable to that. So that is why even accountability is ensured, and whenever meeting happens, then all the minute by minute everything is put up by the RBI. So there is a lot of accountability also in the current setup. So as I said in the beginning, because it is now 4 years since the formation of the MPC and the first term of the first 3 external members has come to an end, it's a right time to see the working of the MPC and to analyze the working, how it has performed, has it been successful or not. So in which case you will need some arguments to say that our MPC has been successful or not. So from the 2 articles that were there in the newspaper, I have collected 4 important issues that those 2 articles spoke about, which you can make a part of your answer. One is related to the appointment of the members, about which we have just discussed how the external members, in spite of knowing that their term is going to end, they were not appointed. The second is related to the rate transmission. So in the last 4 years, Monetary Policy Committee has reduced its repo rate by 250 basis points and now it is at 4%. In spite of the MPC reducing the repo rate, the banks have actually not transmitted this rate to the customers. So banks have had their own issues due to which they have not been able to transmit. So however, the role of MPC is to first of all check the inflation in the economy by manipulating the repo and the reverse repo rate. But however, if banks are unable to transmit the rate cut by the MPC to the customers, then it does not serve the purpose. So therefore, the rate transmission on the part of the banks has been poor, even though RBI has been cutting the repo rate. So this again points to kind of a failure of the MPC to ensure that the repo rate that is cut is also transmitted by the banks. The third is breaching the targets. So if you look at the current retail inflation, it is more than 6%. It's nearly 6.6% or something. So therefore, the target has been now breached, and the RBI, or rather the MPC, has been given a target of 4 plus or minus 2%, which is the tolerance limit. So even this tolerance limit has now been breached, and the inflation level now is more than 6%. So there has been breaching of the targets by the MPC, and it has not been able to contain inflation. Though we know that the reason for this has been so many things, the exigencies, the pandemic and all have played a role. But the fact remains that the inflation has now breached the tolerance limit also. The fourth is a growth versus the inflation confusion that is always going to be there. That is, if inflation has to be controlled, then the repo rate needs to be increased. But if MPC needs to infuse more liquidity in the economy so that there is more economic activity and there is more growth, then the repo rate will have to be reduced. So whether inflation needs to be targeted or whether growth needs to be targeted is always a confusion. So this confusion has led to kind of tiffs between the government and the RBI. Government wants growth and it wants the RBI to reduce the repo rates so that there is more liquidity in the economy. But the RBI wants to control inflation, for which the repo rate needs to be kept a little higher. So therefore, RBI does not, the MPC does not want to reduce the repo rate. So this confusion has led to tiffs between the government and the RBI also. So these are some of the issues in the when you talk about the functioning of the MPCs. Now we move on to the next topic. This is a last topic, which is a very small topic, which is related to the ease of doing business and is a part of your GS3 syllabus. So recently we know that the Vodafone Group has won a case against the Indian tax authorities in the International Tribunal, in the International Investor State Dispute Settlement. So what has happened here is that the Vodafone was taken to court by the Indian income tax authorities, and the income tax department had levied a tax liability of 22,000 crores on the Vodafone. Saying that Vodafone has earned this much from the capital gains that happened with respect to something or the asset that was there in India. So you don't need to get into the details because you will not be asked a question on what was the entire Vodafone case, so elaborate from A to Z. So you won't be asked such a question, but you must just know that this Vodafone was there, and Indian tax authorities had filed a case against Vodafone claiming a tax liability of 22,000 crore on Vodafone. So Vodafone approached the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court ruled in favor of Vodafone, and the Indian authorities then further took this to the International Dispute Settlement, Investment Dispute Settlement as part of the Bilateral Investment Treaty. So India has signed a BIT with Netherlands. So this is a part of the international dispute settlement. So in this now the ruling has been in favor of Vodafone, and again the income tax authorities have lost this case. So this case can be used as an example when you're talking about ease of doing business. So particularly now businesses are moving out of China, and India is trying hard to attract foreign investors into India. So even otherwise, India has been trying to attract a lot of foreign capital into India for India's development. So if India is really serious about wooing the foreign investors into India and making them invest in India, then it has to provide that red carpet to these foreign investors, and it has to ensure that there is a business friendly environment where there is no retrospective amendment to the tax legislations, and also where these investors are not being dragged to litigation court after court. So therefore India has to take care of this. So this can be used as an example when you're talking about the India's measures taken to attract foreign investment or about the ease of doing business. So such litigations need to be avoided. So this example can be quoted. So that way these were the other articles that weren't important, or we have already previously discussed this. So yeah, so there were so many articles that were really not useful from the point of view of exam. And so that is it for today. And again, I'm reminding you, for those who are preparing for 21, if you haven't seen the strategy on my channel, go and watch it and follow that sincerely. So that is it for today. Thank you.